So I reviewed the dissertation of Robert Rokel, which was written in 2011, and it's a case study on the relationship between collective efficacy and the professional learning communities. So the introduction section of the dissertation has several key components that we want to look at. The first one is this topic sentence, which states that schools today receive a lot of mandates from both the state and the federal government in the areas of accountability and student achievement. And with the student achievement, we're looking at closing the achievement gaps. This dissertation was written in 2011, and it states that Nickleby required that the achievement gap would be closed for all students by 2014. With that, job skill levels is another key component that he's putting forth in the introduction section, which he shows that from 1940 to 1970, the skill level jobs were more low skilled jobs. However, with the onslaught of the 21st century learning, we're seeing a flip and seeing more of the high skilled jobs and less low skilled jobs. The research ties into this because a major obstacle to any of the school reforms that we're trying is that teachers were accustomed to working in isolation, and professional learning communities and closing the achievement gaps requires teachers to work more in collaboration and less in isolation. So the problem and purpose of this study is the need for school reform around accountability and limited funding. Nickleby mandated that by 2014, 100% of all students in public schools would meet standards at the proficient level as defined by federal policies, which is Nickleby. So they have to reach this level, yet the funding did not increase. Elements of the PLC can be found in closing the achievement gaps. Several of the things they found were organizing instructional staff. They have redesigning the curriculum, restructuring the school day, all bring about elements that could produce an effective professional learning community. There are varying levels of professional learning communities, from schools who are doing them effectively to schools that don't do them at all. PLCs and efficacy, as of the time of his dissertation, there was no direct link between the two. However, there was empirical evidence linking PLCs to student achievement and student achievement to efficacy, but nothing linking PLCs to efficacy. Some of the purposes of this study, he has three of them. The first one is the relationship between transformational leadership and a professional learning community. The second purpose of the study is to determine the degree in which schools function as a PLC, regardless of its claims of either it's effective or not effective. How do they function and to what degree? The third part of this study is to determine how teacher collective efficacy, or TCE, influence a professional learning community PLC effectiveness. Professional learning communities, teacher collective efficacy, and leadership. Key components here. The first is a shift in the school model. The school model is shifting from one of pedagogy to one focused on student learning, is what Rokel points out. He also points out that teachers need to go from isolation to collaboration. PLCs allows teachers to now collaborate in their school learning. The conceptual framework in this is taken from the DeFore and Ecker's PLC model, which has 6 key characteristics. One of the other components is attention to the teachers. Newman in 1989 stated that major attempts to reform schools paid very little attention to the teachers, which then affects their collective efficacy. PLCs, on the other hand, does not. It pays a lot of attention to the teachers, as Rokel points out. The conceptual strands for this dissertation, there's 2. One of them was, there's actually 2 competing strands within the social cognitive theory. Rotter in 1966's learning theory is one of the strands, and Bandura's from 1977 is the other strand of this conceptual strands. Student gains, Rokel points out research that shows when teachers work together, gains are discovered in both math and reading scores. And leadership, he points out 6 different strands of the transformational leadership that he is focusing on throughout this dissertation.
Overview of the methods and the significance of the study is this next slide we're looking at here. And Dr. Vocal used a case study approach, and he defines that using Yin 2003, which states a case study is the preferred strategy when the how and why questions are being posed, when the investigator has little control over the events and focus on the real life situation. So you have little control over what is going on in the dissertation, so more of a case study approach is required. The significance of this study is there's been a lot of research relating PLCs to efficacy, but not a lot of research relating PLCs to transformational leadership, which creates a gap in the literature in that area. So that's the significance which Vocal is trying to fill that gap.
Research questions. Dr. Vocal had a plethora of research questions. He had 3 of them, and each one had 2 questions within themselves. The first one, he was looking for ways do teachers work in professional learning community, and the 2 sub-questions are what characteristics of the PLC are being demonstrated, as well as how do schools and PLC teams differ in their degree of implementation. So those 2 components will figure out the way do teachers work in a professional learning community. The second one is what is the relationship of collective efficacy and PLCs? In that he's looking for the levels of collective efficacy in this case study, as well as the relationship between the PLC characteristics and the collective efficacy. His third one is the role of the site leader in fostering those, and he's looking at what ways do teachers perceive the principal playing transformational role in implementing a PLC, as well as do principals' leadership, PLC implementation, and collective efficacy interact within each other. Definitions of terms that he lists in this dissertation is learning organizations, professional learning communities, which is a spin-off of the learning organizations, efficacy, teacher efficacy, collective efficacy, transformational leadership, which is fostering the growth of the organization based off of Burns in 1978.
So after reading this chapter, there are several strengths in his dissertation that are key to point out. The first one is clear definitions. He clearly defines the key terms in this chapter so that you clearly know exactly what they are as you continue reading through the dissertation. His second strength is his theoretical explanation. He clearly explains the theoretical components, the 2 strands of his conceptual framework in this chapter. And his chapter overview, the overview of what he's going to write is clearly explained. You clearly know exactly what he's going to be covering, and so you have a really good picture in your mind as you continue to read the rest of it. Weaknesses of the chapter. There's a few weaknesses that I found while reading this chapter that could become strengths if they were worked on a little further. The first one is the conceptual framework. He has a really good theoretical framework, but the conceptual framework, to me, needs a little bit more work to help it really define what it is. He does list a few strands of the conceptual framework that he used, but a more clear definition of that framework would really help this chapter be a lot better. The second one is a clear summary. He does a really good job summarizing his chat throughout the entire chapter, but he doesn't end the chapter with a real clear summary of it. He tells us what's coming up in the next chapters, but not a real good summary of the chapter in itself, which I think really hinders this chapter from being a top-notch chapter. So there's a few things I've learned from reading Dr. Vocal's chapter 1 of his dissertation. The first thing is making sure my definitions are clearly defined and stated so that people understand those key terms as they continue to read the rest of the dissertation. For example, he clearly defined what a professional learning community was, what efficacy is, teacher efficacy, collective efficacy, especially when your key terms have almost the exact same wording in them. Clearly defining what each one is will help the reader, I believe, later on in the dissertation. So making sure that I have those clearly defined, I think, are really good things that I need to make sure I include in mine. Another one is a clear summary. Like I mentioned, as one of the weaknesses to Dr. Vocal's chapter 1 was he didn't have a clear summary at the end of the chapter. Making sure that I clearly summarize exactly what I just reviewed and presented at the end of my dissertation would be something that would really make it stand out, make it pop, and make it easier to understand. A third thing is explaining why it's so important. Dr. Vocal pointed out in his dissertation, chapter 1, why his dissertation was so important and where it filled the need in that gap. So making sure I clearly point that out throughout my dissertation in prominent position so people understand why this dissertation is so important.
And this is the reference to the dissertation itself.